The sea had a language of its own. On most evenings, I could understand it. The whisper of the waves against the rocks, the way the wind carried the salt through cracked windows, the distant call of gulls circling above the lighthouse beam. It had been years since I'd heard another human voice break that rhythm. I'd come to find comfort in silence. Running the lighthouse in through the off-season wasn't much of a living, but it was enough for me. 3 rooms, a fireplace that needed constant tending, and a front porch that looked out over the gray Atlantic. The tourists stopped coming by late autumn, and by winter it was only me and the sea. I told myself I liked it that way, less conversation, less risk of getting attached. That evening, the fog rolled in early. It crept across the cliffs like a living thing, softening every edge. I just finished bringing in the porch chairs when I saw a figure in the distance, walking where the grass met the rock. At first, I thought it was a trick of the mist, some stray fisherman or hiker. But as I squinted, I could make out the shape more clearly. A man, dragging a small suitcase that kept snagging on the uneven path. Something in his gait caught my attention. Not just exhaustion, but defeat. I hesitated for a moment, hands stuffed in my jacket pockets, before starting down the slope toward him. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of rain. "Hey!" I called out, my voice startling against the quiet. The man turned sharply, his eyes wide. He was maybe 30, tall but slightly hunched from the weight of whatever he was carrying, not just the suitcase. "Are you all right?" I asked, stopping a few paces away. He blinked as if trying to focus. Sorry. I think I took a wrong turn. I was just trying to get back to town." His accent was different, city-like, polished. The kind that didn't belong to places like this. "You're a few miles off," I said gently. "And the fog's only getting thicker. You'll lose the road soon." He glanced behind him, as if the fog itself had betrayed him. "Figures," he muttered. "Perfect ending to the day." I could see his hands trembling slightly, the chill biting through his light jacket. "You can stay at my inn for the night," I offered. "It's just up the road." He hesitated, eyes darting from me to the mist. "I don't want to bother you." "You're not," I said. "No one else is staying this week. You'll be doing me a favor, actually, reminding me what company feels like." A faint smile flickered across his face, more out of politeness than ease. "I guess I could use a roof." I led the way, slowing my pace so he could follow. He walked in silence, his suitcase wheels grinding against the gravel. As we reached the inn, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering softly on the wooden steps. I unlocked the door and ushered him inside. Warm air and the faint scent of burning pine greeted us. The small front room glowed with amber light from the fireplace. Shelves of old books lined the walls, and the floor creaked in that familiar, forgiving way that comes from age and care. "Looks cozy," he murmured, his voice low, uncertain. "It's humble, but it keeps the rain out." He dropped his suitcase near the door and rubbed his arms. Up close, I could see the exhaustion written in his eyes, red from crying or from the wind, maybe both. He was handsome in that accidental way people are when they're too tired to hide who they are. "I'm Eli," I said. "Eli Carter." "Daniel," he replied after a pause. "Daniel Reyes." He offered a hand, tentative. His fingers were cold when they met mine. "Can I get you something warm? Tea? Coffee?" "Tea would be great," he said softly, glancing toward the window where the rain now streaked the glass. I busied myself in the kitchen, letting the kettle whistle while I stole a few glances at him. He stood near the fire, staring into it like it could explain something he couldn't. His shoulders rose and fell slowly, as if he were learning how to breathe again. When I returned, I handed him the mug, and he wrapped both hands around it like it was the only warm thing left in the world. "You from around here?" he asked, breaking the silence. "All my life," I said. "My parents ran this place before me. I just never left." He nodded absently. "You're lucky, having roots somewhere." Something about the way he said it made me look closer. "You're not from here, I take it." He let out a humorless laugh. "No, my partner and I were traveling through. Or we were." He decided to go ahead without me. I didn't press, though the weight in his voice told me enough. People only used that tone when something had ended badly. "Sorry," I said quietly. He shook his head. "It's fine. I think I knew it was coming. Just didn't expect it to happen in the middle of nowhere." We sat by the fire after that, neither of us saying much. The rain thickened, drumming against the windows in soft rhythm. The room smelled of pine wood and sea air, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't mind the company. When he finished his tea, I stood and retrieved the spare key from the hook behind the counter. "There's a room upstairs, third on the right. It's clean, and the sheets are fresh." He looked up, gratitude and weariness mixing in his eyes. "Thank you, Eli. Really." I shrugged lightly, just doing what anyone would. But as he took the key, our fingers brushed again, briefly, accidentally, and I felt something electric pass through that quiet space. Not desire, not yet, just recognition. As I handed him the spare key to room 3, I thought to myself, I didn't realize how much that small kindness would change both our lives. Dinner was a quiet thing. 2 bowls of chowder steaming on the table, the old brass lamp casting a soft cone of light over the wooden grain, and the rest of the room falling away into shadow. The rain had settled into a steady percussion against the windows, 1,000 fingertips drumming on the glass. Daniel sat across from me with his shoulders drawn in, the spoon in his hand moving more for the warmth than for hunger. I'd learned not to push. People arrive at the inn carrying storms of their own. Sometimes all you can do is give them a dry place to set them down. "What kind of fish?" he asked finally, as if small, ordinary questions might keep him from floating off into whatever hurt he was trying to outrun. "Cod," I said. "Local. Caught this morning. Mrs. Avery drops a crate by when she's got more than the market wants." He nodded and took another spoonful. "It's good. Real. You can taste when something was made by someone who cared." "Thank you." I busied myself wiping a corner of the table that didn't need wiping. "I try." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was careful. I could feel him measuring his words against the room, against me, against the ache in his chest. I remembered doing the same once, holding my story close like a cracked shell and wondering whether the world would crush what was left inside if I opened it. "I shouldn't have come on this trip," he said at last, voice flat. "But it was his idea. We need a change of scenery," he said. "Maybe we'll remember why we like each other." He breathed out a tiny laugh that wasn't a laugh at all. I guess he remembered something else. "You don't have to explain," I said. "I know." He lifted his gaze to mine and held it for a heartbeat, as if checking whether I would look away. I didn't. He set the spoon down and rubbed his thumb along the edge of the bowl. He kept saying I was too much, too needy, like loving him was some kind of burden he carried on his back. The word hung there, needy. I felt it like a draft through an old door, familiar and unwelcome. "Some people mistake being needed for being trapped," I said, aiming for neutral but hearing the grain of my own history in it. He watched me closely. "Has anyone ever told you that?" "Yes," I said. "A long time ago." I didn't add, "In this very room with the same rain on the same windows." I didn't say, "He left because the quiet here didn't hold him the way it held me." There are things you put into words only when the moment can hold them, and this one couldn't, not yet. Daniel pushed his bowl away and leaned back, as if the chair were carrying him, as if the day had been a long shoreline and he'd finally found some sand to sink into. "He took the car keys," he said, half smiling, small and bitter. "Said he needed space to think." I tried calling him, but he lifted the dead phone from his jacket pocket and set it on the table like a stone. "The outlets in the lounge work," I said, "but the service out here is fickle when the weather turns. You might not get a signal until morning." He nodded. Outside, the wind rose, and the inn responded with the familiar soft moan of old wood settling into a gale. I stood and went to the window. The glass was mottled with rain. Beyond it, the world was a shifting blur of gray. "You picked a dramatic night to get left behind," I said lightly. "Seems on brand," he replied, and the corner of his mouth tilted. A shy attempt at humor that didn't quite make it. The lights flickered. We both looked up. They steadied, then stuttered again. Years of storms had taught me the choreography. I crossed to the pantry, lifted the lid of a tin, and came back with 2 fat, white candles and an old brass holder. "Just in case," I said. "Romantic," he said, and immediately flushed, as if he'd stepped too close to something neither of us had named. "I mean cozy." "It's okay," I said, smiling. "I'll take romantic." The inn could use more of it. As if on cue, the power went out. The room folded into darkness, and for a moment we sat inside the sound of the rain, the wind, and our own breathing. I set the candle into the holder and struck a match. The flare of sulfur lit his face, the slope of his cheek, the startled wideness of his eyes, and then calmed into a gold halo that made the room look like a storybook illustration. Shadows pooled in the corners. The flame clicked against the little glass chimney as it settled. "I can make more tea," I said. "The stove's gas." He nodded. "Please." In the kitchen, the kettle became our lighthouse, its whistle a friendly kind of cry in the dark. I found the chamomile and let it steep while the wind wrote long sentences across the eaves. When I returned, he'd moved a little closer to the fire, elbows on knees, hands laced loosely together. The candlelight gave him back something the day had taken. A softness, a face not just defined by what hurt. I sat and set his mug near him, then mine near me. The heat seeped through the ceramic and into my palms. We sipped in tandem, letting the quiet do some of the work. "He says I feel too much," Daniel said finally. "That I turn small things into, I don't know, weather systems." "Maybe small things are weather," I said. "Sometimes the difference between staying and leaving is just whether someone remembers how you take your tea." He looked at me like I'd nudged a door open inside him. He forgot. Often. My throat tightened around an old memory. The morning my ex had packed a duffel bag in this very hallway, pausing long enough to touch the wall with the reverence of someone saying goodbye to a place, not a person. "People forget," I said softly. "And sometimes they want to." "Did you?" His voice was gentle, not prying, an offering of equality. If he'd given me his fractured piece, he would accept one of mine. "I stayed," I said. He left. The sea was too loud for him, or the silence was. I never got a clean answer. "Does it still hurt?" "Less like a cut," I said. "More like weather arthritis. You feel it when storms come in." He smiled at that, and it was real this time, not borrowed. "That's exactly what it feels like." We drifted through stories that weren't full stories, half-told sentences, small confessions disguised as observations. He spoke of the city and the way the subway wind could feel like a warning. I spoke of winter maintenance on the lighthouse lens and how, once, I'd found a tiny bird asleep on the sill, warmed by the light all night and then gone by dawn. He laughed, then apologized for laughing, then laughed again when I told him the bird had left me a mess to clean. "Maybe that was its tip," he said. We were both leaning forward now, elbows closer to the middle of the table, voices a touch quieter, like we were already moving through a passageway and didn't want to echo. The candle guttered. I steadied the wick with a match. He lifted his mug as I moved mine, and there was a moment, barely anything at all, when the back of my fingers slipped along the side of his hand. Warmth jumped across skin to skin like a surprised heartbeat. "Sorry," I said, though I wasn't. Not exactly. "It's okay," he murmured, not moving away. His eyes held mine a fraction longer than they needed to. Not a question. Not an answer. Pause where both might one day fit. The kettle hissed again, reminding me there was more water if we wanted it. The house gave a soft creak, reminding me we weren't alone in the world even if it felt like we were. The storm flexed, and rain clattered with renewed insistence against the panes. I watched his face when the thunder rolled, the way his jaw loosened a little, some interior knot easing as if the sky had voiced what he couldn't. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not asking for the worst details. I've learned they don't help," I said. "They turn people into the moment they were hurt, and sometimes the moment after is the one that matters." "What's the moment after?" he asked. When the tea is still hot, I said, lifting my cup. When you realize your hands aren't shaking anymore. When you notice the way the light catches the steam. He studied his mug, then lifted it, and I could tell he was trying to see what I saw. The smallest smile rested at the corners of his mouth, new and tender, the kind that could take root if the weather allowed. We talked until the candle burned low and the logs in the fireplace settled into a cradle of orange. Every so often I'd catch myself listening, truly listening, to him, not as an innkeeper, not as a man who sometimes prayed for company and then told himself he didn't, but as someone who had begun to feel the tilt of the room change when Daniel shifted in his chair. I realized, with a quiet startle, how long it had been since I'd wanted someone to stay long enough to know the shape of their silences. A gust pressed its flat palm against the windows and then released them. In the lull that followed, he looked up at me and said, "I don't think I was too needy. I think I was with someone who needed me to be less." "That's not the same thing," I said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." We finished our tea. I blew out the candle and left the room to the glow of the fire. The dark didn't feel unfriendly anymore. It felt like a blanket you've broken in over years, threadbare in places but the exact weight you need. I carried the mugs to the sink, listening to the whisper of his movements as he stood and stretched. When I turned back, he was watching the hearth, the light painting his cheekbones gold. "You should get some sleep," I said softly. "Morning comes early here. The gulls don't care about heartbreak." He huffed a small laugh. "I'll try." At the foot of the stairs, I paused. He did too. There was the now familiar almost touch, both of us shifting just enough to avoid it, and yet feeling it anyway. "Good night, Eli," he said. "Good night, Daniel." He climbed slowly, the steps creaking their old reassurance under his weight. I stood there a little longer than I needed to, letting the house settle around me. Then I banked the fire, closed the window latches, and listened for the soft click of his door down the hall. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, something gentler was beginning to stir. Morning came with the kind of sunlight that felt like an apology from the night before, soft, golden, and full of quiet promises. I woke to the smell of coffee drifting through the hallway. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamed it. The inn hadn't smelled like coffee made by someone else in years. Padding down the creaky stairs, I found Daniel in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, trying to coax the ancient coffee pot into cooperating. A slant of sunlight painted him in pale amber, catching the sleep-tousled curls at the back of his neck. He glanced up and smiled, uncertain but warmer than the night before. "Good morning," he said. I wasn't sure if I should touch anything, but the smell of beans was too tempting. "You figured out the secret," I said, pouring myself a cup. "You have to tap the filter twice, or it sulks." He laughed. Actually laughed, and it was the first sound that made the house feel truly awake. "I guess I'll add that to the list of things I've learned the hard way," he said. I found some eggs, and before long we fell into an easy rhythm. He chopped tomatoes while I scrambled, and the small talk came easier than I'd expected. We talked about nothing. Weather, breakfast, the stubborn stove that refused to light unless you swore at it first. It wasn't much, but it was human, and I realized how long it had been since that kind of lightness lived inside the walls. When we sat to eat, he sighed, stretching his arms. "I checked the forecast," he said, nodding toward the window. "Apparently the storm's sticking around another day." "You're welcome to stay until it clears," I offered, keeping my tone casual, like it was an afterthought. "No point risking the cliffs when they're slick." He studied me for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Thank you. I think I'd like that. Just one more night." I nodded, pretending to focus on my plate, but something inside me loosened, something that had been tight for years. I told myself it was practical. Just one more night. But the truth sat warm and quiet under my ribs. I didn't want him to leave. After breakfast, we tackled the fireplace in the lounge. The storm had loosened the chimney lining again, and smoke had been slipping into the room whenever the wind turned east. Normally, I'd fix it alone, but Daniel insisted on helping. "Honestly," he said, rolling up his sleeves, "I need to feel useful. I can't just sit and stare at my dead phone." "You'll regret saying that," I warned. This place eats up free labor. But as we worked, him holding the ladder, me patching the lining with new mortar, the silence between us was companionable, edged with laughter when the soot fell on his cheek like war paint. You missed a spot, I teased. He swiped his hand across his face, leaving a darker smear. Better. Worse, I said. Much worse. He chuckled, and the sound hit me like sunlight after too many gray days. It was strange, realizing how easily he fit into the rhythm of the inn, as if he'd always belonged here, in this in-between world of wind and wood smoke. By afternoon, the rain had thinned into mist, the kind that blurred the horizon until sea and sky became one. Daniel stood by the window, watching the waves crash against the distant rocks. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, eyes far away. You look like someone listening for an answer, I said quietly. He didn't turn. Maybe I am. I joined him at the window. Outside, the gulls swooped low over the water, fearless against the spray. When he left, Daniel began, voice low. I kept thinking I could fix it if I just said the right thing. I chased him halfway down the road before I realized he wasn't slowing down. It's like he took a version of me with him, the one that believed in staying. I didn't say anything for a long moment. The rain tapped softly against the glass, and the sea kept breathing its ancient rhythm. Maybe sometimes disappearing helps us find who we were before, I said finally. He turned then, eyes glistening in the pale light. And what if there's nothing left to find? Then you build something new, I said. Something quieter, maybe, but real. He smiled sadly, looking down at his hands. You sound like you've done that before. I'm still trying, I admitted. The afternoon drifted by in lazy calm. We fixed what needed fixing, brewed tea, and talked about small things again, the kind of small things that kept grief from swallowing the hours. When I mentioned the lighthouse at the far edge of the cliffs, his curiosity lit up like the first spark of a lantern. Can we go? He asked. The path was muddy, but the rain had softened into a fine drizzle, so we went. The cliffs stretched before us, a long ribbon of green and gray. Wind pushed against our coats, tugging at the edges, but Daniel walked beside me with a steadiness I hadn't expected. The sea feels endless here, he said as we reached the overlook. Back home, it's just a view. Here, it's alive. That's what I love about it, I said. It reminds you how small everything else is. He tilted his face to the wind, eyes closed, as if letting the salt air erase something. For a moment, I simply watched, the way his hair lifted, the way his shoulders eased for the first time since he'd arrived. I used to think I had everything, he said quietly. A good job, a partner, plans. Then one argument, one cruel sentence, and it was all gone. I feel like I disappeared overnight. You didn't disappear, I said. You just stepped out of someone else's story. He turned his head toward me, studying my face. And you? Whose story did you step out of? I hesitated. The sea filled the silence between us. A man who wanted the city, who thought loving me meant giving up too much sky. He nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his eyes. Maybe we both lost people who didn't know how to stay still. Maybe, I said, or maybe they made room for us to find something better. We stood there until the horizon began to blur into twilight. The lighthouse beam swept across the water, a pale arc of light cutting through mist. Daniel's face glowed for a heartbeat in its path, then faded again into shadow. On the walk back, he was quieter, but the silence wasn't heavy. It felt full, like something unspoken was taking shape between us. Inside, the inn was warm again, fire crackling, lamps glowing softly. Daniel brushed the damp from his hair and smiled at me, the edges of fatigue replaced with something gentler. Thank you, he said. For what? For today. For not treating me like a broken thing. I shook my head. You're not broken, just rewriting yourself. He laughed softly. I'll have to borrow that one. We ate dinner by the fire, simple stew and bread, and the quiet between us felt natural now, not awkward. Every so often, he'd glance up, and I'd catch his eyes before either of us looked away too quickly. There was a charge there, subtle but undeniable, humming in the spaces between our words. When he finally stood to head upstairs, I found myself wanting to prolong the moment. "Storm's supposed to clear by morning," I said. He paused at the foot of the stairs. "Then I guess I'll be gone by noon." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Safe travels." But the words tasted wrong, like saying goodbye before I was ready. He smiled faintly, hesitated, then said, "Good night, Eli." "Good night, Daniel." He disappeared up the stairs, his footsteps soft against the wood. The house settled into its old rhythm again. The sea outside, the fire's gentle hiss, but everything felt different. The quiet no longer comforted me. It reminded me of what it felt like before he arrived. That night, I found myself listening for his footsteps in the hall, long after he'd gone to bed. The storm returned that evening like a ghost unwilling to be forgotten. The sky darkened too early, the horizon swallowed by gray. By the time we'd finished cleaning up from dinner, the first crack of thunder rattled the windows, and the lights flickered in nervous sympathy. I was stacking wood by the hearth when Daniel appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, the faintest crease of worry between his brows. "Is this normal here?" he asked. "Completely," I said, setting the last log down. "The sea likes to remind us who's in charge." He gave a shaky laugh. "Good to know. Guess I'll stop waiting for the forecast to make sense." Outside, rain began in sheets, thick, heavy, relentless. The sound filled every corner of the house. We both turned as another thunderclap rolled overhead, close enough to make the glass tremble. Then, with a small sigh, the lights blinked once more and vanished completely. For a second, there was nothing, just the deep, living darkness and the heartbeat of the storm. Daniel exhaled a quiet curse. "Perfect timing." "Stay there," I said, already feeling for the drawer where I kept the matches. "I've got it." A few strikes later, a warm flame bloomed into existence, catching on the wick of the first candle. The small light turned the room into a world of soft gold and long shadows. I carried it upstairs, the boards creaking beneath my steps, until I reached his room. He was standing by the window, watching the storm with his arms folded, his reflection a ghost among the flashes of lightning. When he turned toward me, the candlelight caught the edge of his face, the line of his jaw, the weariness softened by the glow. "Delivery service?" he asked, smiling faintly. "Comes with the room," I said. "No extra charge." "Good. I'm already over budget." The flicker of humor between us was enough to ease the tension. I set the candle on the small table by his bed. "You all right?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Storms used to scare me when I was a kid. Still kind of do. Then you picked the wrong coast to get stranded on." He laughed under his breath, then glanced toward the window again. "You ever get used to it?" I considered that. You learn to read them, know which ones pass, which ones break things. Sometimes the noise outside just makes the quiet inside feel louder. He looked at me for a long time before saying softly, "You talk like someone who knows what loneliness sounds like." The honesty in his tone caught me off guard. I tried to hide behind a smile. "I've had enough practice." The thunder answered for us. The house creaked and rain pounded on the roof like it wanted in. I realized he was trembling, not out of fear exactly, but from the exhaustion of carrying too much for too long. "Come on," I said gently. "Let's get a fire going here too." We worked together wordlessly, arranging kindling in the small hearth across from his bed. The match flared bright, then dulled to the orange heartbeat of new flame. The fire caught quickly, and the air filled with the familiar scent of burning pine. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, his knees drawn close, watching the sparks rise. "You know," he said after a while, "if someone wrote this scene in a book, it would sound made up." "What scene?" "This. Lost tourist, stormy night, handsome innkeeper showing up with candles at the perfect moment." I chuckled, stirring the fire with the poker. "You think I'm handsome?" He froze, then smiled sheepishly. "I walked right into that one." "Maybe," I said, "but I'm not complaining." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it lingered, like warmth spilling into cold corners. Then the silence that replaced it wasn't awkward anymore. It was alive, humming with something unspoken. I sat beside him on the edge of the bed, close enough to feel the faint brush of his sleeve against mine. Outside, the rain grew heavier, drumming on the roof with a rhythm that almost sounded like breath. "I keep thinking about what you said," Daniel murmured, eyes fixed on the fire. "About disappearing. Maybe I've been trying too hard to make people see me, and it just made me vanish faster." "You wanted to be loved," I said. "That's not a crime." "Felt like one," he replied. "He used to tell me I was too emotional, that I needed too much reassurance." I started apologizing for existing in the room. I let out a slow breath. "I know that kind of love, the one that makes you smaller every day." He turned his head toward me, and in the flickering light, his expression was so open it hurt. "Did it ever stop hurting for you?" "Not really," I said honestly. "It just changes shape. You learn to live beside it instead of under it." He nodded, eyes glistening. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned slightly, just enough that his shoulder brushed mine. I didn't move away. The contact was nothing, and everything. Warm, fragile, real. "I've been afraid," he whispered, "that maybe I'm unlovable unless I'm fixing something, giving something, being exactly what someone wants. That without those things, I'm just too much or not enough." I turned to look at him. The firelight danced in his eyes, flickering like tiny storms inside. "You deserve love even when you're lost," I said quietly. "Especially then." His breath hitched. He closed his eyes for a second, like he was trying to let the words settle somewhere they could stay. When he opened them again, he smiled faintly. Soft, uncertain, but grateful. "Thank you," he whispered. "You don't have to thank me for saying the truth." He shook his head slowly. "No one ever says it like that." The next clap of thunder made the candle flame shiver, and he instinctively leaned closer. I stayed still. The smell of rain and smoke filled the space between us, and the world outside felt impossibly far away. Without thinking, I reached out and laid a hand over his. His fingers hesitated for only a moment before they turned under mine, intertwining. His grip tightened. Not desperate, but steady, like someone finally exhaling after holding their breath too long. We sat that way while the rain poured, the fire painting gold across our joined hands. He shifted slightly, resting his head against my shoulder. My chest ached at the smallness of the gesture, at how natural it felt. "I don't know what happens after this," he said softly. "You don't need to," I replied. "Right now is enough." He nodded against me. "Right now is enough," he echoed. The storm raged on, a restless giant outside our walls. Inside, everything slowed. The sound of the fire, our breathing, the pulse beneath his skin where our hands met. We didn't kiss. There was no need. The connection between us was already fuller than words, deeper than the moment could hold. Eventually, his head grew heavier against my shoulder, his body relaxing as exhaustion claimed him. I stayed there, still holding his hand, afraid that moving might break whatever fragile peace had settled over us. The rain softened, the thunder moved farther away, and the only sound left was the quiet rhythm of his breathing. In the faint light of the dying fire, I watched his face. Calm now, open, unguarded. The kind of face that told stories without speaking. For years, I'd convinced myself that solitude was safety, that the absence of pain was enough to live on. But sitting there, feeling his fingers still loosely wrapped around mine, I realized how wrong I'd been. This simple human warmth was what I'd been missing. Outside, the waves crashed endlessly against the cliffs. Inside, something far more dangerous had started to take shape. I told myself it was comfort, but comfort had never felt like fire before. Morning arrived with the softest kind of forgiveness. The storm had blown itself out overnight, leaving the world rinsed clean. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the sunlight spilled through the windows like honey. For the first time in days, the horizon was visible. a clear blue line that separated the calm sea from the wide, open sky. I woke before Daniel, half expecting the night to feel like a dream. But when I stepped into the hallway, I could hear quiet movement downstairs, the faint clatter of dishes, the hum of the kettle, and the low murmur of someone humming an unfamiliar tune. I found him in the kitchen, barefoot, hair slightly mussed, sleeves rolled up as he arranged toast on a plate. The sight stopped me for a heartbeat. He looked at home, not like a guest passing through, but like someone who belonged in this small corner of the world. "Morning," I said softly. He turned, smiling. "Morning. I hope you don't mind. I found coffee and figured I'd start the day off right. Yours or mine?" "Yours, definitely," I said, grinning. "I never hum in the morning." He laughed, that low sound that seemed to warm the walls of the kitchen more effectively than any fire. We ate together at the small wooden table. The light was gentle. The breeze slipping through the cracked window carried the sound of distant gulls. There was no rush, no edge of awkwardness anymore. Just the kind of silence that feels earned, like two people breathing in sync without trying. At one point, Daniel leaned back in his chair and said, "I was thinking of staying until tomorrow, just to make sure the roads are dry." "Good idea," I said far too quickly. Then, realizing my eagerness had escaped, I added, "You don't want to get stuck in mud again." "Exactly." He smiled knowingly but didn't push it. I busied myself rinsing the dishes, pretending not to notice the faint warmth creeping into my chest. The truth was simple, I didn't want him to go. I had spent years convincing myself solitude was enough, but the past 2 days had quietly rewritten that truth. His presence filled spaces I hadn't realized were empty. After breakfast, Daniel noticed a can of white paint sitting on the porch. "What's that for?" "The railing," I said. "Been meaning to repaint it since the last storm." He picked up the brush. "Then let's do it." I started to protest, habit maybe, but he was already dipping the brush into paint. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said, cutting me off gently. "You've done enough for me. Let me return the favor." So we worked side by side under the sun. The railing gleamed with fresh white strokes, each layer covering the worn, chipped surface from winters past. It felt like more than maintenance, like renewal. Every stroke was a conversation neither of us had to speak. "You're good at this," I said. "I watched my dad fix up our porch when I was a kid," he replied. "He used to say you can tell how someone's doing by how much care they give to things that don't talk back." "That sounds like a man who understood life," I said quietly. "He did," Daniel murmured, eyes focused on the brush. "I think he'd like this place." I glanced at him, the sunlight catching in his hair, the faint smile softening his face. "I think he'd like you," I said before I could stop myself. Daniel's hand paused mid-stroke. He looked up, our eyes meeting for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then he smiled, a small, grateful thing that reached his eyes. When I turned back to my section of railing, I didn't notice until too late that I'd gotten paint on my cheek. "You missed a spot," Daniel said, nodding toward me. "Where?" I asked, wiping the wrong side of my face. "Here," he said, stepping closer. His hand came up slowly, thumb brushing against my cheekbone. The touch was light, almost reverent. He wiped away the streak, leaving warmth where the paint had been. Neither of us moved. His eyes lingered on mine, and for a second the world narrowed. The sea, the gulls, the wind, all falling away into the soft thrum of shared breath. Then he pulled his hand back, clearing his throat. "There," he said softly. "Fixed." "Thanks," I managed, voice rougher than it should have been. The rest of the day unfolded gently. We took breaks, shared lemonade, laughed at the uneven patches of paint where one of us had lost focus. When the last railing was done, Daniel stepped back, admiring the work. "Looks new again," he said. "Better than new," I replied. "It has stories now." He smiled at that, eyes glinting with something I couldn't name. By sunset, we carried 2 mugs of coffee to the cliffs. The air had turned cooler, and the horizon blazed with gold and pink where the sun melted into the sea. We sat on the grass, shoulders almost touching, watching the waves roll endlessly toward shore. For a while, we didn't speak. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything we hadn't said yet. Then Daniel exhaled slowly and said, "You helped me remember how to breathe." I turned to him. "What do you mean?" He smiled faintly. "Before this trip, before everything, I forgot what calm felt like. I kept trying to fill silence with noise, work, people, plans. But here, with you, it's different. The quiet doesn't hurt." I swallowed hard. "It's the same for me," I admitted. I didn't realize how much of my life was just waiting for something to change. Then you showed up in the fog, looking lost, and suddenly the world felt alive again. He looked at me then, really looked. The fading light traced gold along his jaw, his lips, his eyes. He reached out, his fingers brushing mine. I didn't pull away. "Eli," he whispered, as if saying my name for the first time. "Yeah." He hesitated, eyes flicking from my lips back to my eyes. "I don't want to go tomorrow." My heart kicked hard against my ribs. "Then don't." His breath caught, the faintest sound, like a wave just before it breaks. And then he leaned in. The first kiss was soft, uncertain, a question asked in the language of warmth. His lips tasted faintly of salt and coffee. The world stilled around us, the wind pausing, the gulls falling silent. When his lips touched mine, I stopped hearing the sea. For the first time in years, I heard my heart. The next morning carried a brightness that almost felt cruel. The sun came up clear and golden, waves glittering like they were mocking the storm that had passed. I made coffee in silence, listening for Daniel's footsteps on the stairs. When he finally came down, his expression was different, distracted, distant. He sat at the table, phone in hand, the faint glow of the screen lighting his face. I didn't ask, but he spoke anyway. He messaged me. His voice was soft, as if he didn't quite want the words to exist. I set my cup down carefully. "Your ex." He nodded, eyes still on the phone. "He said he wants to talk. Said maybe we were both at fault. That he overreacted." There it was, the weight that could undo days of quiet healing. The ghost knocking at the door, asking to be let back in. "What are you going to do?" I asked, keeping my tone even. He shrugged, still not looking up. "I don't know. Part of me wants to hear him out. The other part," he trailed off, thumb brushing across the screen. "The other part doesn't want to feel small again." I wanted to reach for his hand, to tell him he didn't need to respond. But it wasn't my place, not yet. So I just nodded and said, "You'll know what to do when you're ready." He finally looked at me, searching my face like he wanted me to give him an answer. When I didn't, he sighed. "I'm going to take a walk." The door closed behind him with a quiet finality. I spent the next hour pretending to busy myself, refolding towels, wiping down the same counter twice, staring out the window as gulls wheeled overhead. The sea looked deceptively calm, but I could feel the unease beneath the surface, the pull of something unsettled. I didn't see him for the rest of the afternoon. His absence filled the house like a hollow echo. Every creak, every gust of wind through the eaves made me look up, expecting him to appear. When evening fell, I walked out to the porch and saw him in the distance, a dark silhouette against the cliffs. The wind whipped his jacket, and the mist rose off the water, catching the last shards of light. He stood there motionless for a long time, facing the horizon, like a man holding a conversation with the sea. I didn't go to him. Maybe he needed that space to decide not what he wanted but who he wanted to be. Still, watching him alone against the vastness made something in me ache. By the time he came back, the night had settled fully. The door creaked open, and Daniel stepped inside, soaked through with mist. His eyes were red-rimmed but steady. I was by the fireplace, the flames low and steady, a book unopened in my lap. "Hey," I said softly. He stood by the door for a long time before finally walking toward me. His voice, when it came, was quiet but sure. I deleted his message. I looked up. "You did." He nodded, sitting across from me. I thought about what he'd say. The apologies, the promises, the way he'd make it sound like leaving me was just a mistake. He shook his head slowly. But it wasn't. It was a choice. And the worst part is, I kept waiting for him to realize what he lost. But the truth is, I was the one who lost myself trying to keep him. I let the silence hold his words. The fire popped softly. Outside, the waves murmured like an old lullaby. I don't want to go back, he continued, voice trembling now. Not to him. Not to that life. Here with you. For the first time in a long time I feel safe. Like I don't have to pretend to be smaller to fit. My throat tightened. I wanted to say everything. That he wasn't just safe, he was seen. That I hadn't realized how much I'd been waiting for someone to walk into this place and make it feel like home again. But instead, I stood, crossed the small space between us, and knelt beside his chair. Then stay, I said quietly. He looked down at me, his breath catching. You mean that? Yes, I said. You don't owe the past another chance, Daniel. You've already earned your peace. His eyes filled, and before either of us thought about it, I reached up and brushed the damp from his hair. He leaned into my touch like someone who'd forgotten what it was to be held without being asked to earn it. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I was scared that this, whatever this is, was just something temporary, like the calm after a storm. It doesn't have to be, I said. Storms end. That doesn't make the calm less real. He smiled then, a small, trembling curve of his lips. You always know how to say the right thing. I don't, I admitted. I just know what it's like to need to hear it. He reached for my hand, fingers sliding against mine, warm despite the chill on his skin. You helped me remember how to breathe, he said softly. And I don't want to forget again. The words hung between us, tender and raw. I rose slightly, our faces inches apart, and this time when he kissed me, it wasn't hesitant or fragile. It was real. The kind of kiss that spoke of things rebuilt, not just begun. His hand rested on my cheek, mine at the back of his neck, and the firelight painted gold across the space between us. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine. I didn't expect to find this, he whispered. Neither did I said. But I think maybe that's the point. We sat by the fire until the logs burned down to soft embers, talking about nothing and everything. He told me about the life he'd left behind, the crowded apartment, the noise that never stopped, the people who didn't listen. I told him about the winters here, the way the sea froze at the edges, and how sometimes I'd light all the lamps just to feel less alone. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was two people speaking softly in the aftermath of too much noise. And yet, it felt like the most honest moment of my life. Eventually, he grew quiet, eyes heavy with exhaustion. I guided him to the couch and handed him a blanket. When he looked up at me, I saw gratitude there, but also belonging. Stay here, I said. You don't need to go anywhere tonight. He nodded. Good night, Eli. Good night, Daniel. I sat by the fire long after he fell asleep, listening to the rhythm of the waves outside. For the first time, the sea didn't sound lonely. It sounded alive, like it was breathing with us. When dawn came, I woke to the faint sound of footsteps on the porch. Daniel stood outside, wrapped in the blanket, watching the sky turn from indigo to gold. The lighthouse beam swept across the sea one last time before fading in the growing light. He turned as I joined him, his breath visible in the cold morning air. I came here lost, he said softly. You showed me home. I didn't answer right away. I just stood beside him, watching the sun climb above the water, lighting up the world we'd both thought we'd lost. In that moment, I realized something simple but profound. The inn wasn't meant to be just a refuge for travelers. It was a place for beginnings disguised as shelter. I glanced at him, the light catching in his eyes, and smiled. Then stay, I said again. He nodded, returning the smile. And in that quiet exchange, everything was decided. Later that morning, as we brewed coffee and opened the windows to let in the salt air, I found myself listening to the sea's familiar rhythm. It wasn't the same song anymore. It didn't echo with emptiness or ache with waiting. It moved with life, with warmth, laughter, and the steady beat of something new. Some travelers come looking for directions. Others find what they didn't know they were missing and choose to stay. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Tell me in the comments, have you ever found comfort in the most unexpected place? Your stories inspire the next one. Stay with us for more slow burn, emotional gay love stories every day, where lost hearts find home again.